Welcome. I'm James Jordan, Director of the Parks Institute, and it's my pleasure to host this evening's talk. Our speaker this evening is Jonathan Kaplan, and Jonathan is here as an International Visiting Fellow, a scheme that we've been running for many years, which affords someone 1 to 2 months at the University of Southampton using the archives, and pleasure to see Jenny and Karen here as well. And so those people out there in the internet world, please feel free to apply and come to us and make use of our resources. Jonathan is going to talk to, sorry, I'll start with Jonathan, who Jonathan is. In your own time. Jonathan is Senior Educator and Research Manager at the Sydney Jewish Museum and Adjunct Fellow at UTS. And he will be speaking to us this evening on the subject of the Schnorrer and the Parvenu, Jews, tailoring, and the performance of respectability. Jonathan, over to you.
James. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, James, and thank you everyone who's here tonight and everyone online. I'll just quickly share the slides. Sorry, bear with me. Should know how to do this after years of Zoom. There we go. And so as I was saying, many thanks, and thank you very much to the Parks Institute for the opportunity to come and use the archives, especially to everyone who's made me feel so welcome on a daily basis, in particular Tony, Claire, and Noemi. And also many thanks to Karen and Jenny for actually facilitating my visits to the archives and access to the Rare Books collection. It's been really invaluable. So what I'm talking about tonight is it's part of a bigger project that I've been working on. This, I suppose, is the preliminary results of it that looks at Jews and clothing within the context of migration from Eastern Europe at the late 19th and early 20th century, but specifically within the context of Yiddish language materials. Tonight, I'm going to be talking less about the English context, which is what I've been focusing on while I'm here in Southampton and what I'm going to be continuing to look at. And it's a little bit more transnational in focus, so looking at Eastern Europe as well, or I guess what happens before migration, that big wave of migration, as well as a little bit on migration to England and to America. Anyway, without further ado, in September 1894, Samuel Garfinkel wrote to Abraham Hoffnung, president of Liverpool's Jewish community, with a peculiar request. In light of the impending Rosh Hashanah services, Garfinkel sought permission on behalf of Liverpool's foreign Jews to mark the new year in a service of their own, separate from the established community at the newly consecrated Moorish Revival Synagogue on Prince's Road. Instead, he proposed that the foreigners hold their own service, either in the old synagogue or in a schoolroom, for 2 reasons. The first, he argued, related to the decorum of Anglo-Jewry's established synagogues, which was unfamiliar to the foreigners and would cause confusion. Now, he didn't actually elaborate on what he meant by that confusion, whether that was that this would be confusing to the foreigners who weren't familiar with decorum in synagogues, or whether their presence and their lack of decorum would be confusing and create disruption for the established Anglo-Jewish community. The second reason, one that's seemingly trivial, but as a dress historian, I would argue is no less important, pertained to the sartorial choices of the foreigners. He wrote, "They feared that they could not appear at Prince's Road so well dressed as they could wish to join the company of their richer brethren, and they would not like to attract the notice of the persons resident in that society, who for the most part entertain little or no regard to our sacred religion." I haven't been able to track down Hoffnung's reply to the request. Indeed, whether he permitted a breakaway service in favor of the foreigner's discomfort is unknown. But in this instance, it's actually irrelevant. Garfinkel's proposition raises an important issue not unique to Liverpool or wider Anglo-Jewry, but one that was debated across Europe and North America with the advent of an increased migration from Eastern Europe during this last third of the 19th century. The perceived distinction between East and West. What has largely been absent from this vast literature on the topic, however, is the function of clothing in both perpetuating stereotypes and refuting them. Garfinkel's letter, in particular his comments about the foreign Jews' inability to attend the synagogue well-dressed, recalls a common visual and linguistic trope of late 19th and early 20th century Jewry: the bearded Schnorrer in tattered clothing, and his wealthy top hat wearing, cigar smoking counterpart of the Parvenu. The binary was commonly presented in the context of then and now, depicting a rag wearing Schnorrer as a recent immigrant, hungry and drawn, a pack thrown over his shoulder, before his transformation into the opulent and well-fed plutocrat, whose fortune has been amassed through dishonest means, a visualization of what Hannah Arendt would later refer to as the pariah Parvenu binary. And in order to talk about this, and especially getting to this point in anti-Semitic discourse and also the reality of dress practices of Eastern European Jewish migrants at the beginning of the 20th century, I'd like to go back into the history and give a little bit of a historical overview on Jews' clothing and modernity in the East. Be a man in the street and a Jew in your tent, but the well-known maxim of the Russian maskil Judah Leib Gordon. Taken by some as a call to abandon external signs of Jewishness, Gordon's pithy declaration drew on existing calls for Jewish self-improvement over the previous decades. As Michael Stanislavski has argued, Gordon's poem was by no means a call for Jews to assimilate, but rather to become modern Jews in the context of a modern and enlightened Russian culture. By the time Gordon issued this call to action in the 1860s, Jews throughout Europe, both those embracing assimilatory ideals and those loyal to traditional modes of Jewish identification, had by and large adopted modern European dress. However, in the popular literature of the period, Europe was divided between West and East, the former embracing modernity and Enlightenment values, and the latter stubbornly clinging to outdated lifestyles and religious ideals. Such binary representations were designed, particularly in the context of anti-Semitic literature, but also masculine literature as well, to evoke a sense of disgust or at least apprehension towards the figure of the Jew, reminding audiences of his perceived foreign origins, implied, among other things, by his patterns of dress. However, visual evidence from across Europe at the fin de siècle and early decades of the 20th century reveals that men, Jewish men, like others in large and small urban centers, dressed in suits and other tailored garments as a standard uniform of male dress. But little scholarly attention has been paid to these sartorial choices. And yet dress played an important role within the Jewish diaspora in both managing identity and access to modern liberal institutions and workplaces. With reference to photography, Yiddish-language advice literature, and scholarship on the tailored suit, this lecture will explore questions of dress, Jewishness, and the performance of respectability. In examining the patterns of Jewish male clothing consumption, my research seeks a new understanding of the function of clothes in the context of modern Jewish subjectivities during a period of political and social change, both within the Jewish world and the wider societies in which they live. And I know I've been quite consciously using the term the Jew and talking about the Jewish man, using this in the masculine. And the reasons for this is that it goes back to the way in which that term was used in the literature historically. The Jew typically refers to the Jewish man rather than the Jewess or the Jewish woman who serves a related, albeit a different figure. And of course, the way in which these two figures in anti-Semitic literature, as well as even in Yiddish literature during the 19th century, address questions of clothing quite differently. Okay. The modernization, or perhaps westernization of Eastern European Jewry during this time was not solely the result of the Haskalah, but similarly influenced by external factors. During the first half of the 19th century, Russia embarked on a project of attempted Jewish modernization and Russification for the purpose of making Jews useful to the Russian Empire, while simultaneously maintaining discriminatory positions towards them. The Russian government recognized the importance of clothing in this context and imposed a series of decrees concerning dress on its newly acquired Jewish subjects. The use of clothing as a tool for control and repression, of course, isn't new, nor was it unique to Jews. There's been quite a vast literature on sumptuary laws, for example, in the medieval and early modern period. Even within the Russian context, a century prior to introducing these decrees on Jewish clothing, Peter the Great introduced a dress reform across all levels of Russian society, from the aristocracy down to the urban working classes. The reform entailed abandoning old Russian styles of dress, with their vaguely Oriental appearances, excuse me, in favor of clothing that followed French, English, and German fashions, with the intention of modernizing the Russian population and bringing it closer within to the sphere of the West. Consequently, by the time Russia absorbed the bulk of Polish-Lithuanian Jewry, the Russian population had already been subject to Peter's modernizing dress reforms for almost a century. Jews, however, had for the most part been denied entry into the Russian Empire, and as such hadn't been subject to these reforms, nor were they permitted to reside in most parts of the empire after the dismemberment of the Commonwealth. We know that, and there are many of you in the room tonight who have greater expertise than I do in history of East European and specifically Jews in the Russian Empire. We know that of course, the so-called Pale of Settlement in which this newly acquired Jewish population was forced to live. And while Poland, or as it was known, Congress Poland, the Kingdom of Poland, wasn't part of the Pale, its population was still subject to Russian rule, and its Jews accordingly subject to discrimination. Jews lived throughout Poland in most cities and towns, and were often distinguished from their Gentile neighbors by differing professional practices, religious traditions, and sartorial appearances. In Warsaw, for example, the de facto capital of the former Commonwealth, Jews made up a small but visible minority with their distinct patterns of dress, and served as a reminder to the Russian overlords of Jewish difference. In an attempt to modernize Warsaw's Jewish population, Russia introduced a series of clothing decrees. The first two in 1809 and 1821, in the form of residential restrictions for wealthy Jews, who would be given the option to live and work outside of the city's traditional Jewish quarters if they adopted modern dress and abandoned traditional Jewish forms of professional practices, I should say, money lending and artisanal positions. And the third and more aggressive clothing decree was issued in April 1845, in which the government announced a ban on all forms of Jewish dress, effective from 1850. And this was in favor of specifically Russian, French, and German attire. However, as Glenn Diener has argued, in offering Warsaw's Jewish population the choice between Western attire on the one hand and Russian dress on the other, those Jews who wished to retain traditional patterns associated with Judaism or the Jewish community found a loophole in the similarity of Jewish styles and Russian styles, particularly in the tradition to wear long coats, certain types of fur hats, and the fashion to grow beards. And of course, these images, particularly the photograph on the right, is of course much later in the century. However, we can see how this follows, or this continues throughout the post-decree. Of course, the clothing decrees alone were not responsible for Jewish sartorial modernization. Many Jews themselves participated in this program of modernization. In 1841, only 4 years prior to the government's clothing decree, a group of masculim penned a memorandum to the governors of the Pale of Settlement on the Russification of the Jewish population. Much of the memorandum addressed the issue of modern Russian education in Jewish schools. However, the final item addressed dress habits. With the authors arguing, inasmuch as Jewish dress has no relation whatsoever to religious law, the Jews must be ordered to change their dress for the clothing commonly worn throughout the country, according to the social class to which they belong. That all Jews who exchanged Jewish attire for modern European clothing did so out of masculine conviction is far from the truth. Nor did all Jews choose to acculturate to Russian culture, despite the Russian cultural and political hegemony. As Diener asserts, Jews who voluntarily adopted sartorial change did so for several reasons. They had internalized the dominant culture's discomfort with traditional Jewish styles. They hoped to obtain exemptions from residential and other restrictions, or they simply desired to integrate into the Polish bourgeoisie. Like their co-religionists in other parts of Europe, Polish Jews were not a homogeneous bloc, and while some held fast to traditional lifestyles and material culture, others embraced modernity. The emergence of the nation-state, industrialization, societal modernization, and the long period of Jewish political emancipation over the 19th century placed European Jewry in a difficult predicament. Rabbis and lay leaders encouraged their co-religionists or flocks to identify not as Jews, but as Germans, Poles, Frenchmen, as Naomi explained in her wonderful lecture a month ago, of the Mosaic or the Israelite faith. However, the question of nationality was a complex matter, interlinked not only with language and culture, but also religion and the emerging concept of ethnicity or race. Roger Brubaker, for example, has addressed the opposing forms of civic nationalism, with members of the nation working towards a common civic goal, and the more insidious ethnic nationalism emerging in East Central Europe during the 19th century. Jews living in Congress Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, including parts of Austria-Hungary, found themselves as actors in the context of the latter variety of nationalism. This complex interplay between nation, ethnicity, language, and religion raised questions about a Jew's place in the nation. Could an individual who continued to maintain the religious traditions of Judaism be considered a fully fledged German, Pole, Russian, or insert nationality here? While this matter was complicated when considering Jews who had adopted modern Western fashions, the language and often secular cultural ideals of the Gentile majority, those Jews who continued to maintain old styles of dress and speak Yiddish were regarded as aberrations and clearly at odds with the national image. Excuse me. Further complicating matters was the transformation of the idea of a Polish nation. Prior to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth dismemberment by Austria, Russia, and Prussia at the end of the 18th century, the question of Polish identity was broader than language and ethnicity, encompassing members of diverse religious, linguistic, and ethnic groups who lived in quite broad territories. The state's destruction and its numerous attempts to revive it during the course of the 19th century combined Polish political sentiment with emerging discourse on the nation-state. The meaning of Polish national identity emerged as one of linguistic, territorial, and in some cases, ethnic group identification, as Dorota Litwin-Lewandowska has argued. Many aspiring middle-class Jews in Poland's larger cities embraced a linguistic and political definition of Polishness, and yet the majority of Polish Jewry, both the urbanized and the rural, maintained some level of religious difference and spoke Yiddish alongside proficiency in Polish. Over the course of the 19th century, many Jews in Poland and the Pale developed a sort of hybrid identity, both Jewish and Polish, or depending on where they were living, Russian. This hybridization was often played out across multiple generations, with the younger reaching a further step along the acculturation continuum than their parents. The abandonment of traditional Jewish cultural mores is emotionally highlighted in Pauline Wengerow's well-known Memoirs of a Grandmother, in which she offers an intimate snapshot into the lives of East European Jewry. Through her own experience from her childhood in a traditional Jewish home in what, in the Jewish context of the Jewish world, was considered Lithuania at the time, but today is part of Belarus, her family's, or her husband in particular's assimilatory aspirations, and the eventual conversion and assimilation of her children into Russian Orthodox society. While descriptions of clothing and its role in the Wengerow family's acculturation feature throughout the memoir, one chapter in particular, titled The Change of Garb, focuses on clothing, specifically the impact of the government's 1845 clothing decree. Men, she argues, were required to relinquish the long coats and breeches for shorter jackets and trousers in the emerging style of the modern tailored suit. Wengerow stresses that while clothing decree forbade Jews from appearing in this traditional manner in public, at home many of the Jews allowed themselves to wear the only clothing that had pleased them, the old garb. However, given her husband's assimilatory ambitions, modern clothes would prevail in the Wengerow household. The intergenerational assimilatory process and sartorial modernization Wengerow describes was not uncommon, as is evident from ego documents as well as visual sources that exist. In my own family collection of photographs are several images taken in ateliers that depict well-groomed, smartly dressed young men. Although undated, the clothing worn by these men suggests that the photographs were taken sometime towards the end of the 19th century or in the early decades of the 20th. The young men have neatly parted or coiffed hair, as we can see. They wear the typical dress of urban men of the period: tailored jackets, stand or turn down white collars, and a variety of neckwear. There's nothing significant about the clothes worn by these men that would indicate national, ethnic, or religious origins. Overall, there's a sense of generic Western men's tailoring with its connotations of the English gentleman and refined Bromelian restraint that appear in countless other photographs as well as periodicals published throughout Europe. The tailored suit, with its 17th century origins, was adopted over the ensuing centuries as a standard uniform for men across Europe, and further afield, of course, undergoing numerous evolutions. In 1775, the Osnabrück jurist Justus Moser argued that all men should adopt a standard uniform, a black coat. Although such a proposal was not implemented in Osnabrück or elsewhere in Europe during the period, urban men across Europe would, by and large, embrace this form of dressing. Adopted by the merchant classes during the 18th century, the suit developed an image of Protestant sobriety with its connotations of thrift and industriousness that would symbolize the aspirations to improve one's situation in life. As scholars such as Anne Hollander has argued, the donning of sober suits and demeanors by middle-class men was no less performative than other forms of fashionable consumption. To don a tailored suit was a means for conforming to and perpetuating an idea of masculine respectability. For acculturating Jews, both Eastern and the Western, this was a central component of self-fashioning and adhering to modern Enlightenment values. Depicted in the aforementioned photographs are three brothers from a middle-class family, Josef, Isaac, and David Pshenica. Their clothing is neat, sober, and follows the general tenets of male sartorial respectability across Europe, as well as, of course, further afield, the wider Western Hemisphere. Only the names of Warsaw photography ateliers stamped on the backs or bottom of these images offer clues about the sitter's wider context. At the turn of the century, Warsaw, as Congress Poland's most populous city, was home to a diverse kaleidoscope of Poles, Russians, Jews, and other ethno-linguistic groups. The Pshenica brothers don't wear the simple attire of rural peasant populations, highly decorated folk costume with their strong nationalistic connotations, nor the garb associated at this time with traditional Orthodox Jewish communities. Their tailored attire offers a performance of masculine bourgeois sensibilities, common throughout the larger cities of the Russian Empire. And yet these young men were the sons of the hatmaker Chaim Pshenica, a devout Orthodox Jew whose patterns of dress and grooming, if surviving photographs and family law are to be relied upon, reflect the visual stereotypes of East European Jewry. In her transnational study of tailoring, modernity, and socio-economic class divisions, Anja Meyer-Rose asserts the central role of dress in the making of the German Jewish middle class, describing such tailored garments as and I quote, the uniform of the bourgeoisie. And this was no less true of urban Polish Jewry. The brothers dress in tailored suits, albeit of different styles, that reflect not only the change of men's fashion at this time, but also the variety and diversity of menswear. In the carte de visite on the left, Josef Pshenica, the eldest son, sits stiffly, his hair oiled and coiffed to full volume, and the tips of his thin moustache waxed to a point. He wears a dark jacket with satin-faced lapels, a white stand collar, and a small black bow tie. The image next to him, we have his younger brother. Taken some years later, Isaac, a slightly more mature but nevertheless still young man, posing slightly bent forward, his arms resting on what appears to be a banister or possibly a plinth. He too wears a dark jacket and a stiff white collar. His dark attire is reminiscent of the standard uniform of white-collar men. It's in the details of grooming that his bourgeois material privilege become apparent. His dark tie is held in place by a pearl-studded tie pin, and his sleeve cuffs are held in place by cufflinks, trinkets that serve not only a practical function, but also one of aesthetics. What's clear from these photographs, and actually before I go on, I'd like to speak briefly also about the youngest son. I think this particular image is quite interesting in that if we look at his clothing, David's clothing, objectively, there's nothing out of place here. The clothing appears to be well taken care of. It's the way in which he's styled it, the way in which he's wearing it, that we have some issues, namely in that clothes are too big for him. And this raises interesting questions about, I guess, domestic economies and clothing, the tradition that possibly, and I don't know in this particular case, but one might be able to assume that there's perhaps purchasing larger clothing to fit into, but we don't know this. I can see Claire shaking her head vigorously in the front row. Claire, I would say, is the expert in this, given that she's done a lot of work on the boys in Victorian England. But it does raise questions as to styling, if perhaps it's not about purchasing clothes sizes slightly bigger so that one can grow into them. Certainly questions about knowing how to wear clothes or not. which I will take up in a later part of this paper. Questions of how does one become socialized into perhaps, I guess, the skill of dressing properly. What's clear from these photographs, back to the formal part of this talk, is that these young men wore clothing that followed general patterns of wider men's fashion. However, their clothes also distinguished them as members of the bourgeoisie. Where exactly they purchased their clothes, whether they purchased them from tailors, in fact, the middle son himself was a tailor, whether they got it from cheaper clothing warehouses or from department stores is unknown. And similarly, the level of, I guess, conscious association that they held between their garments and English styles can't be determined. However, the garments appear similar, if not identical, to those worn in other parts of Europe. Warsaw at the turn of the 20th century is only one example of this widespread tailoring phenomenon. Dressing in an English manner didn't follow a single tailored uniform. Even within English society, as has been argued by many scholars, the difference between class-based sartorial practices were blurred and were constantly shifting, as well as where one chose to purchase specific garments, whether a suit might come from a tailor and a shirt might come from a clothing warehouse or a department store. In addition to not knowing where these brothers purchased their clothes, where they learnt to dress according to modern conventions also remains unknown. Dressing is a social act, one that can be learnt. In this manner, the changing sartorial habits of East European Jews during the 19th century and early 20th centuries should be viewed within the context of migration. Not only internal, but the turn of the 20th century, Warsaw served as a central locus for Jewish immigration, not only internal immigration from other parts of Poland, but from other parts of the Pale, as well as beyond Russia's borders. While the brothers Pszenica, like their contemporaries, or many of their contemporaries, were born in Warsaw to Varsovian parents, their acculturation from traditional Ashkenazi culture to modern Polish society can be understood as a form of internal migration, whereby natives of one locale acclimatized to the larger co-territorial in-group. In learning to adapt to the language of sartorial modes, the bourgeois mores of the Varsovian middle class, acculturating Jews were in a sense moving from one locus, albeit symbolically, along migratory lines. But acculturation wasn't instant. Rather, it was a process that's played out on multiple levels. It took time for an immigrant to learn to learn the language of the majority, embrace and integrate into the dominant culture. Dressing, however, is not necessarily instant, but it's a lot faster. And by dressing, one might indicate or symbolize that they've already begun that process of acculturation. But how does the immigrant learn to dress? Geza Teichert, a German fashion historian, has argued that while an individual can be instructed in the practices of correct dressing via printed material in magazines or etiquette guides, socialization offers a more holistic education. However, socialization requires to an extent a level of acceptance on the part of the in-group that the newcomer wishes to join. Without acceptance or integration, habits of dress learned through observation run the risk of aping the elite or using fine clothing to obscure an individual's origins. A common accusation leveled at acculturating European Jews over the second half of the 19th century. In the face of widespread social discrimination that newcomers face from their home societies, both from non-Jewish dominant society as well as the already acculturated Jewish communities, printed advice attempted to bridge that gap. In the 2 decades following Garfinkel's aforementioned letter to Hoffnung regarding the synagogal and sartorial habits or predicaments of Liverpool's foreign Jews, Eastern Europe saw a major wave of Jewish emigration spurred by increased persecution, including pogroms, and in 1890, the expulsion of Jews from major Russian cities. In its wake, Poland and the United States emerged as the 2 main centers of world Jewry, the former, along with other parts of East Central Europe, serving as a reservoir for immigration to the latter. The majority of the immigrants passed through English ports. Some remained behind for various reasons, including insufficient funds, family connections, or business opportunities. British and American Jews, with both the long established, as well as immigrants who'd already had time to adapt to their new homes, often saw the newcomers as a cause for embarrassment. The solution was to educate recently arrived immigrants about life in their adopted cities, with their Anglo-Saxon Protestant cultural hegemony. In England, excuse me, organizations like the Russo-Jewish Committee provided evening classes in English instruction for the purpose of facilitating Anglicization and, to quote Lloyd Gardner, the disappearance of the despised Yiddish. The committee published the Yiddish-English Manual in 1894, compiled by the Australian-born folklorist Joseph Jacobs and the banker Herman Landau, whom Gardner describes as the first immigrant from Poland to become proper Anglo-Jewry. Undergoing multiple reprints over the course of the 1890s to the 1920s, the manual provided English-speaking Yiddish learners with phrases supposedly useful to their new lives in England. Not only was it a dictionary of sort, but an etiquette guide addressing topics such as domestic life, work, consumer goods, and travel, as well as instructions on drafting various types of social and professional correspondence. The manual offered itself as a guide to Anglicization beyond language, with phrases verging on a caricatured understanding of Englishness. For example, when discussing breakfast preferences, I drink only a cup of tea in the morning and eat bread and butter and boiled eggs. I like cold roast meat or smoked fish and tea in the morning. Throughout the manual, there's a sense of instructing the readers, who are immigrant Jews, to improve themselves, particularly in relation to self-presentation through grooming, dress, and living conditions. Phrases relating to etiquette, such as, the table is without a cloth, lay the cloth, I wish to dine, are significant less for raising questions as to whether Yiddish-speaking immigrants from Tsarist Russia or Austria-Hungary were familiar with the niceties of bourgeois domesticity, but for what they reveal about Anglo-Jewish perceptions of the immigrants, and a wish to transform them into genteel English women and men. Included in the manual are various phrases relating to clothing and the correct way in which clothing should be worn, particularly in a subsection that deals with linen and clothes. However, clothing is also addressed in other sections, in fact, throughout the entire manual, highlighting the centrality addressed to everyday life. The manner in which clothes are worn betrays good or poor manners. Of particular relevance is a sample text that presents a scenario of two immigrants who meet on a street corner and discuss their place in the new society. When pressed about his smart appearance by his friend, the other man replies, "People here think a lot about a man's outward appearance. They think that if he takes care of himself, he will take care of his work. And if he is slovenly and careless in his appearance, that is a sign to them that he'll be careless in his work. Besides, they judge all of us by each of us. And if I were dirty and slovenly, they would despise not alone me, but you and all of our race and creed." The protagonist also argues that as they are now in a new country, dressing properly is a matter of respecting the customs of wider society, particularly in the context of being accused of having abandoned the traditional customs of ancestors, at which he argues, well, you see, our ancestors were careless in their appearance because they lived among people who were equally careless, thus betraying a bias against Eastern Europe and its inhabitants that, of course, was no truer than an assumption that all Englishmen were well dressed. More than instructing readers on how to dress, the anecdote provides readers with a rationale for why they should be well dressed and neatly groomed. Such attempts at self-fashioning were a question of one of Judaism's core ethical teachings, derech eretz, the way of the land, or colloquially, good manners. Self-respect was the first step to receiving respect from others and acceptance as Englishmen, or at least that was promised, to say nothing of the counter-stereotypes that derided fashionably dressed Jewish consumers. Reading the manual, there's very little that can be regarded as Jewish, beyond the fact that it's written partly in Yiddish. Even the variety of Yiddish that's employed is less the spoken, what at the time was referred to as a jargon, with which the readers would have been at home, but instead an academic or a literary form of Yiddish that's more orthographically German, albeit Yivo's standardization of Yiddish orthography didn't occur until the 1930s, and it preferences German vocabulary over Semitic and Slavic words. The result is that the variety of English phrases and sample texts would be no less relevant translated into the languages of many other non-English-speaking immigrants who arrived on Britain's shores during the same era. In contrast, across the Atlantic in 1912, the New York-based Hebrew publishing company released the Yiddish-language Etikette, a Wegweiser von leidlicher Aufführung, Höflichkeit und schöne Manieren von Männer und Frauen. Etiquette, a guide to proper conduct, courtesy, and good manners for men and women. which was far richer in its use of Jewish themes and culture. The volume offered itself as an all-encompassing etiquette guide for newly arrived Yiddish-speaking immigrants, promising to teach the ways of genteel and gentile Anglo-American society, offering advice on topics such as polite conversation, behavior in all sorts of settings, both in public and in private, table manners, courtship, marriage and divorce, and correct dressing. And this was more of it wasn't a manual in the sense of the Yiddish-English manual. It was published entirely in Yiddish without English translation. With regards to clothing, Barbara Schreier has argued in her study of the dress habits of Jewish immigrant women in America that clothing was central to the acculturation process. To newly arrived immigrants, a change of clothes was the most visible way they could identify themselves as American Jews, she asserts. And while mastering English required time and study, how much easier was it to embrace the symbolic language of American clothing? Like his intended readers, the author, Tashrak, the pseudonym of Israel Joseph Zevin or Yisrael Yosef Zevin, was himself an immigrant to New York from the Pale of Settlement. A journalist by trade, Tashrak would gain recognition for his humorous depictions of Jewish immigrant life, and his sharp wit peppers his expert advice on good manners. In attempting to persuade his readers to emulate Americans, Tashrak arraigns his newly arrived co-religionists for their old world manners, using language both anti-Semitic, classist, and misogynistic. Jewish women in particular are singled out for their showy tastes in bold colors and excessive application of jewelry. Men, however, are let off lightly, with Tashrak asserting that it was easier for them to maintain an image of sobriety due to the slower pace of men's fashion, which in turn made it possible to stay up to date and avoid looking old-fashioned. And it's because of this very perception of male sartorial sobriety and persisting discourse on the femininity of fashion that many studies of immigrant dress typically focus on women. Tashrak's overall advice on correct dressing was by no means novel. His commentary reflects wider discourse on fashionable dress published in multiple languages in Europe and America. The key to being well-dressed is outlined in the beginning of his chapter on clothing. Correct dressing is to avoid novelty and not to be subject to the tyranny of fashion. Conforming to the widespread contemporary discourse, Tashrak characterizes this tyranny as feminine. For men to dress in an ostentatious manner is inelegant, and Tashrak highlights the tendency of Jews to dress too stylishly as a reason for criticism, in a manner reminiscent of contemporary anti-Semitic and homophobic discourse. Instead, Tashrak's Jewish male readers are advised to follow the example of Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor's famous list of 400 and embrace simplicity over showiness. While much of his advice reads like, contemporary fashion literature, fashion advice in Europe and America, this particular etiquette guide has a distinct Jewish coloring with reference to Jewish festivals, the Shabbat, and other aspects of daily lived Judaism. For example, when discussing the possibility of men taking more of an interest in fashion and updating their wardrobes as often as women, Tashrak sarcastically remarks that the prayer Jewish or devout Jewish men recite every morning in thanks to God who has not made me a woman, or Shelo Asani Isha, would thus have to be removed from the prayer book. What follows his introductory remarks, or rather warning to his male readers on not being effeminate in their dress, is typical of wider discourse on how to behave, not only with regards to dress, but how to be correctly masculine. And the obvious homophobic and misogynistic subtext is very relevant here. In anti-Semitic literature, the gender identity and expression, and of course, the implied sexuality of Jewish figures are often presented as distorted binaries. Men are depicted as effeminate and women as masculine. While upholding this masculine-feminine gender binary in critiques of anti-Semitism, of course, denies the lived experiences of Jews who didn't conform to such expressions of gender, not taking into account the lived experiences of sexuality, depicting Jews as contrary to the norms of a Eurocentric gender identity and expression turns the Jew into an anomaly, and perhaps into something queer. That Tashrak, a Jewish writer, should peddle in stereotypes is no surprise. Many Jewish writers and thinkers of the period were strongly influenced by anti-Semitic and misogynistic discourse, and thus applied it to their own writing as a form of ethnic self-critique. Indeed, Tashrak advises readers on the correct form of dress to be worn in specific social contexts times of day, as well as seasons. He also talks about how clothing should be correctly fitted. When it comes to formal attire, both full evening dress as well as dinner jackets, Taschrak advises evening-only events, listing specific contexts in which such attire is appropriate: weddings, banquets, other evening receptions, visits or attending the opera, and other evening affairs. However, he offers an interesting exception to this rule. Both are under no circumstances worn during the day in this country, except on Yom Kippur, in temple, when the Jewish aristocrats attend worship during the day in full dress. And this short passage is significant not only for revealing the solemnity of the day among the Jewish elite of New York, but also due to the terminology used. It's relevant to highlight that although writing in Yiddish, Taschrak uses the German words Tempel and Gottesdienst, temple and worship or prayer service, rather than the commonly used Yiddish words Shul and Davnen, indicating the predominant reform stream of Judaism practiced in the United States. But the use of this subtle use of language also emphasizes the German origins of New York's Jewish elite, as well as the Americanizing aspirations contained in the volume. Focusing on the sartorial habits of the elite of American Jewry, a socioeconomic sphere to which the vast majority of the Yiddish-speaking immigrants were denied entry, Taschrak's advice offers a goal of respectability and refinement to which the new immigrants should aspire. In conclusion, clothing and the way in which it was worn were essential to the process of acculturation and modernization among East European Jews during the early decades of the 20th century, relevant to both those who remained in Europe and those who left its shores. To don a finely cut suit was not necessarily a sign of desired assimilation and loss of Jewish identity, as common anti-Semitic caricatures or literary sketches suggest. Like their co-religionists in Western contexts who embraced modern dress and styles of grooming for multiple ideological purposes, Jewish men in the East similarly changed their wardrobes under the influence of varying factors, both external, such as governmental pressure, discrimination, as well as general fashion, and internal, inner community pressure and individual desires. Overall, beyond embracing modern clothing for the purposes of visual conformity, the sense of respectability and restraint modern attire, when worn correctly, was said to bestow on its wearers is palpable in the literature. Originating from Maskilic thought, such sartorial transformations would leave a lasting impact on the character of East Central European Jewry and its migration destinations over the latter part of the 19th century and early decades of the 20th. While this lecture has outlined some of these influencing factors and their manifestations in the form of photography and advice literature, a further examination of masculine Jewish dress patterns in the context of diverse political ideologies, expressions of gender and sexuality, influencing socioeconomic factors, and of course the differences between Eastern Europe and immigrant communities, whether they be in Western Europe, in Britain, or America, is still ripe for further research. Thank you. I have to apologize. I should have started off by apologizing for my cough, just getting over a cold.
Thank you, Jonathan. No need to apologise for anything. Loan me a comb. I lost mine in 1985, as well, I could say. So, thank you. A wonderful talk covering so much ground. Do we have questions? And please feel free to ask questions online as well.
Hello. Yeah, I was speaking. Now, since you know the dates of birth of the three brothers, could you just say very briefly what those dates were?
I can't remember that for all of them. The eldest was early 1890s. I can't remember specifically. The younger was, the middle was, I think, 1 or 2 years younger than him. And the younger was at least 5 years younger, yeah. Okay,
so there were a couple of things that struck me as ways of exploring very different presentation of those three young men. One is a gradual shift in what was thought to be appropriate based on time. And the youngest one, if he's photographed maybe around 1920, standards were less.
So that would have been before 1920 because he was a soldier in the First World War and died in action.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you. I mean, for example, the collar is a soft collar.
Yes.
As opposed to a high standing collar. The other thing is that so far as I can make out, that actually wearing 3 different levels of dress. The one with the satin lapels looks to me like a formal
Dinner jacket,
which would be suited for young people, also potentially for getting married. And you would have to look at dates and see if that was the case. And that's also really important as a marker of social status, because you can't have an evening outfit unless you also have the afternoon outfit and the morning outfit. The middle brother is wearing what I would see as a smart daytime outfit, suitable for maybe appearing at the office if you were a professional. The youngest, I mean, you would be able to look at this, is to me dressed more informally in a way that would be suitable for someone who was, for example, a student. And what you have identified as the loose cut, that's deliberate. He's wearing something called Chesterfield. So he's wearing an outfit that is less formal. And no, he wouldn't have been purchased clothes to grow into. I mean, he's over the age of puberty. And even if he were, that would have been upwards from him, outwards. So I think there are a couple of things going on there. And if you were to look at what you know about the life stages of the 3 young men, then you will be able to work out what's being represented. And also, you know, even in 1915, people weren't photographed all that often. So you might even be able to say, okay, well, that's a point in their lives when it's likely that photograph was taken. The youngest might have been photographed before in this, for example.
Could be. I mean, based on the photos I've seen him as a soldier, that was it would have been several years earlier because he looks a lot maturer in his military uniform, just in terms of his body structure. But thank you. That's incredibly helpful, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. Initially, before I come to you, I'm going to Tony first. I'm also going to repeat the question once you've asked it. A version of the question.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was brilliant. Just wondering, in terms of the advice given, did that also extend to sort of facial hair? Some remarkable moustaches. I don't know if the relatively remarkable like you. I don't know if you considered.
No, actually, I haven't.
But do they tell them what's appropriate, or is that really on?
So the question is asking about facial hair and whether that's also addressed in this way.
In the American 1912 guide, yes, facial hair is dealt with, but I haven't focused on. I'd have to go back and read because I didn't focus on it in preparing this. In the English, the Yiddish English manual published by the Russo Jewish Committee, no, facial hair isn't addressed. Interestingly, nor is particular hairstyles, other than being neatly groomed. But it just doesn't really elaborate on what that means to be neatly groomed. That's very interesting. I suppose I mean, this is going a bit off topic and not quite answering the question, but it makes me think of the images that were published in Yiddish immigrant newspapers in England at the time that included, like in English language newspapers, photographs of politicians, but particularly in the Yiddish newspaper, of prominent Jews in Anglo-Jewish society. I suppose that we might consider those the hairstyles in those photographs and moustache or beard styles also as a form of advice, visual advice for the immigrants. It's something I need to look into more.
Thank you. Anishka.
I wanted to follow on from Claire's point about photography and ask if you could just explain a bit more about how this was used. I suppose with the more journalistic photos show a wider spread of class, but those photographs are surely self-selecting in that you have to be able to afford a photograph.
Absolutely.
And then therefore would obviously have a kind of more luxurious form of dress. And I guess I also don't know how often those photographs would be taken. Would you save your best outfit for it and then never wear it again? So I can talk a bit more about that.
I think, yeah.
Again, this question is about the photographs and asking a little bit more about the background to the photographs, what we know about the photographs.
I think we have two experts on this in the room, James and Claire, who have more expertise than me on the matter of photography. But in short, in relation to reserving your best clothes, or would you not wear it at other times? I think it comes down to class, to socioeconomic class, and how often one could afford to have their photograph taken. Whether those clothes would then only be reserved for that or worn regularly. I suspect not, that people wouldn't be keeping a pair of clothes and only wearing it once just to have their photograph taken, particularly if they couldn't afford, it would just be impractical. Yeah, I think it also depends on, it also comes down to time period and where photographs were taken. In the later period, so in the 1920s, in various European cities, I imagine the same. My expertise is in general in Austria, Hungary, less so in Britain, but I imagine the same is true here. There's a sudden, I guess, upspring or wave of openings of cheap photographic studios, which of course changes the capabilities or the possibilities for people who might in the past not have been able to afford to go to a nice atelier, to go to a quick photo studio and have a quick snap taken. But yeah, it's I guess class-based, but also time period as well, and of course location. If someone's living in a small shtetl in Poland or Belarus or Ukraine, there are opportunities for I guess the not just opportunity, but the options where they could go to take their photo is going to be far more limited to whether they're in Warsaw, London, Vienna, Berlin. I don't know if that answers the question. I'm not sure. Thank you. I think there are a few.
Should we go online?
Online. Make this bigger.
I think you can just scroll down.
Okay. Marius asks, is there a difference between how young bachelor men relied on fashion to perform certain ideas of masculinities, and how important that was for married men, family, fathers, where they differed, where they approached by fashion magazines differently? I actually don't know how to answer that, Marius. I would have to do more research on that at this point.
Well, you have to come back then.
Yeah.
That's sorted.
But thank you.
Well done. Thank you, Marius. No? Okay.
I think, yeah, that was the only question online.
Didn't ask you. You have to chair as well. I'm terribly sorry. Claire.
Yeah, would you explain, maybe you mentioned at the beginning, but why you are focusing on men and women? Because we know that, of course, the masculine, the modern Jews talked also a lot about women, and in particular, Schnorrer and Ettinger wrote a play very early in the 19th century. It was a big deal. And in a way, the process of acculturation or of changes and modernization of women in Eastern Europe is very often said to be faster in some ways than the men's one. So I was wondering, clothing might be a way of confirming or nuancing this.
So this question from Claire is about it's about women.
Well, yeah, following up on that, the last point about the acculturation of women being a lot faster than men, you said that. I guess it relates also to, with questions of dress, comes back to questions of how Jewish women or Jewish girls were educated in Europe, in contrast to the boys. Of course, it varies, and you know this from your own work more than I do. Greater exposure to Polish language than the boy in the shtetl who would be going to a yeshiva and studying Hebrew. in the wider work, I do look at women. For this paper, it was only men. The reason for that, as I explained at the beginning, came back to the terms the Jew and the figure of the Jew. Also, time constraints for this. But I think in the overall project, I look both at men's and women's clothing. Yeah.
No, I'd like to make a kind of side comment on that, which is that for women in a religion that prized female modesty, the stakes were radically different in 1910 and 1925. Because in 1910, fashionable dressing required relatively little bodily display. I mean, even the display of the collar would be quite shocking. But by 1925, fashionable dressing required the display of the lower half of the neck. And that may have actually created a barrier for women from households where female modesty was prized. And there is a further issue, which is hair and head coverings. The photograph with the grandmother at the front. Of the family.
Yes.
I mean, the grandmother has her head covered.
Yeah.
The mother, we didn't know she might be wearing a wig, but the daughter looked as if she had something on her head.
I think a hat.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's also the question of jewelry.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah, you see.
Sorry, I'll share this so that those on the women can
Yeah,
see that as well. Yeah, like a little
yeah.
type of thing.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the grandmother's head covering is definitely not fashionable. No, I mean, it's literally not something that was part of the fashionable head covering vocabulary. If the daughter is wearing hat or headscarf, it's not a fashionable one. I mean, the fashionable hat is one on the left. Now that's what I would call a fashionable hat from 1910. So, you know, there might be some really quite subtle signifiers that might have been apparent to people at the time. I mean, 1910, it's easy to wear a hat the whole time, so the modesty is not an issue, but by 1925, yeah, it could be an issue.
Well, thank you. It's interesting. And what's interesting, this is again a side note, but with this family in particular, I've received these were sent to me by a man here in the UK when I was doing my PhD on Vienna. They're his ancestors, but it's really interesting to consider this photo, and unfortunately I don't have the others on me now, but in relation to all the other photos in the family and looking at as they arrived from Poland in Vienna and became acclimatized to Vienna, they become far more, I guess, familiar and fashionable in their appearance. Of course, not the grandmother so much, but certainly the children. And that's something that you often see I mean, that's not unique to this family. You see that a lot in family albums of families moving from smaller shtetls to big cities, whether Vienna, Berlin, or London. Yeah.
Maybe first and then Emily.
I was wondering, because what you were talking about tonight is mostly a certain category of Jews in dialogue with broader society, with expectations from the state, from reformers and so on, from masculine reformers. I wonder if you could say a bit more how more and more attention to how people dress, how men dress, is also emerging in dialogue with what is more and more stringent focus on dress from emerging ultra-orthodoxy. I mean, I'm thinking of Adam Sofer and his famous acronym Lachem, with the last one being Malbush, with like an emphasis on dress and that it should not change, basically. So, yeah, if you could like, say how basically these reformers and people who want to freeze at a certain point, how they are in dialogues on
To be honest, it's not something I've looked at yet, other than come across it in readings, but I haven't followed it up. In terms of, I mean, it's something that I'm interested in and will look at. In terms of the, I guess, Haredim and Haredi dressing as a response to modernity, it's really interesting when, I mean, I'd have to read the texts written by not only the Chasam Sofer, but other rabbinical figures at that time and into the interwar period. But it's really interesting to consider visual representations of Hasidim in interwar Europe and the diversity of clothing, both among Hasidic women and men, that there's far less uniformity than we see today in Hasidic communities. I mean, of course, there's the shtreimel of some kind and a long black coat, something often referred to in the German as a kaftan, or in Yiddish a kapot or a bekisher. But they're not identical styles, in contrast to when we see photographs today of, or I mean, not just photographs, if one visits Stamford Hill on a festival, there's far more uniformity among Hasidim. And dress scholars who deal with Hasidic dress, the name escapes me of what I'm thinking of, have argued that this is very much a response to, like Hasidic or extremism in Hasidic communities, it's a response to the Holocaust. So the uniformity of Hasidic dress today is not something that resembles closely or even faithfully Hasidic dress of pre-Holocaust Hasidism. That doesn't really answer your question. I'm afraid I can't really answer it, but it's, I guess, an interesting point that comes to mind.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. It's really, really fascinating. I guess it's kind of hard to tell from the photographs. I have a question about colour, and you mentioned, for example, the rise in the fashionability of the black jacket as a kind of sign for civility. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the relationship between clothing, modernism, and colour.
But yeah, I mean, often there is this assumption that it is only black or grey clothing, when of course the reality is that it wasn't. There was a lot of diversity in men's dressing. Of course, depending on the period or decade, things change. So throughout the 19th century, while a black suit might have been very fashionable, it might have been worn with a highly coloured or patterned waistcoat, or paired with accessories, ties or cravats, a buttonhole. But then we see in the early 20th century, again, it's not just the monochromatic black or grey, but there are varieties of browns, excuse me, greens, even blues, not necessarily, a shocking blue that we might see today. But it's not. What I mean is that it's not just black and grey. There was variety in men's colour. Just like in the 19th century with the waistcoats and cravats and other accessories, pops of colour, of course, remained and came through into the 20th century as well. It reminds me of one thing that comes to mind is a memoir I was reading of, again, this comes back to not this topic, but my work on Vienna, a memoir of a man written, I think it was many years later, but describing his childhood and his youth in Vienna in the 1920s. In which his mother took him to the tailor and said, okay, you can choose whatever suit, you can choose your style of suit, you can choose your fabric, I'm not going to intervene, you're old enough now. And he chose a rich, reddy brown color. It's described as a red brown, probably a maroon of some kind. And when he wore it, he proudly wore it everywhere. When his father first saw him dressed in this suit, he looked at him and said, you look like a pig farmer from the Puster, which is a Hungarian plain. So of course, the color, no, that doesn't mean that everyone was wearing color just because it was available. Again, it often comes down to socioeconomic class as well, what people can afford. If you can afford to buy a suit, multiple suits in multiple different colors, in the same way that if we're talking about women's wear, multiple dresses in the same colors, and not, as opposed to having one dress that is going to, or one suit that you will have to wear more often than others because you can't afford. So again, that doesn't really answer it in great depth. But
James.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Yeah, I've got lots of questions. Maybe on the photography side, it's the Raphael Salmon, the historian, was just saying we always need to put quotation marks around photographs. I think we do it that way now. I know you said that, but it's my sense is that these photographs come from different sources, because you talked about family albums, but some are clearly produced to be sort of distributed. So when they were made, they obviously had. It's hard because PowerPoint tends to sort of the digitization tends to sort of render them all the same sort of thing. But when without seeing them sort of in sort of material quality, I guess it's hard to tell how cheaply they've been made, you know, or what their intended audience would be. So, I had a couple of suggested thoughts in terms of your sources, because if these are mostly coming from private collections or family albums, it was possible to get photographs made in studio portraits, particularly in urban areas, as you said, and even sometimes in rural ones, really very cheaply, even in the 1860s. So that's not a new thing in the 1920s. It was, but they tend not to survive. So things like tin types, which is incredibly cheap, but they just don't survive. So whereas things that are preserved because they are precious and they're in albums for family things, for example, or archived, they tend to survive. So it's like, why has this thing survived rather than something else? But my suggestion was, I wondered if you looked at crime scene photographs of police photographs, because police archives are really fascinating. There's loads in New York, for example. Because obviously people are not expecting to be photographed in shot or some other violence. The homicide records are really fascinating sources of information about things like domestic interiors and also dress, because people are captured. They're not in their best clothes going to the wedding or a fancy photograph. They are called unawares. So that's one source. The other thing I was thinking about, the question about colour, which I think is fascinating. I don't know if you looked at the Albert Kahn archive, the archive of the planet. I think it's all been digitized. But he was a wealthy French Swiss banker who hired a team of photographers in the early 20th century, so between 1908 and 2015, to go around the world to amass a collection of photographs of everywhere, of people. And they're colour autochromes, and they're beautiful photos. A lot of them are very beautiful photographs, but they are colour. They're a fascinating source of information and a kind of snapshot of all sorts of different people from all around the world. So I think that might be useful.
Well, thank you. That's very useful. Well, thank you very much. I'll follow that up.
As a side note, Camille Blackman from London College of Fashion has actually published on other photos from the early 20th century and talks about them and what they tell us about fashion, and is preparing yet another publication. On
Camille Blackman. Thank you.
I just asked a quick question about methodology. And do you start with the photograph, or do you start with the text?
Or
does it just vary?
It varies, depends. With this project, I think from memory I started with the text, with the etiquette guide. The American one. And that kind of got me into the topic, and then, but then other times I start with the photograph.
Just think there's the relationship.
I've never actually considered that.
Images, well, the word image is, the relationship is just fascinating. I just wondered which one guides it. Right. Any more questions? I think we've worked you hard for your this evening. So we just thank Jonathan again. Thank you, everybody, and thank you.